I think the best way to think about Indigenous law is that they are collaborative, reasoned processes that Indigenous peoples, our societies, managed ourselves through time. We were able to have intellectual resources through our stories. We were able to draw from those to solve problems, solve conflicts, and deal with all of the messiness which is created when human beings live together.
Law is what grounds us to the earth and those relationships we have with our territories, with the animals, with the plants.
Indigenous peoples were the first law keepers and law givers in this land. In Anishinaabe, which is the Indigenous language that I can speak from the Great Lakes area, we organize life in accordance with principles of Minno B'Madazuin, which means to try to live well in the world.
For me, the large context that I like to think about for law is the set of stories that help us regulate ourselves and our relations with others.
In its best form, the way to think about law that's helpful is that it enables human dignity and agency and provides ways for people to challenge internal oppressions, internal power dynamics.
And as we deliberate with one another, as we talk with one another, it's obvious that persuasion is needed at that point. Because you can't just do what you want. You have to do this as a group, as a community, as a collective of people. And part of that persuasion is understanding that it's not just what once was important to Indigenous peoples in their laws, it's what's important to us today. So for instance, concerns about gender have been sometimes neglected within Indigenous communities. And in order to be persuasive with our deliberations, we need to ensure that gender is taken account of in a way that doesn't stereotype, generalize, create vulnerabilities or power imbalances. So persuasion is always a present-oriented activity, which means that our traditions are living traditions.
The work that my grandmother's done, Dr. Ellen White, her name's Corntassel, she's done work all of her life sharing Coast Salish traditions with the outside world. But very early on, she understood that it's an important part of the work is to help people know us. She took long, complicated, sophisticated adult stories and made them children's books. It's interesting because at Tsleil-Waututh, they just did their own environmental assessment of the Kinder Morgan project over in Vancouver. They said to the world, we're going to do our own environmental assessment in accordance with our own law. And they turned to a body of knowledge from the Coast Salish world, including my grandmother's stories, were part of the foundation that they used to articulate the Coast Salish legal principles.
What we're trying to look at is to use the Indigenous law, that whole piece about restoring relationships, about creating accountability, but also about creating restitution and creating peace back in that community once that individual returns. We need to do the work there. I need the Indigenous legal traditions and the laws to be able to spell out a bit of a plan. So I reach out to knowledge keepers, elders, hereditary leaders, to ask them what are the underlying principles here that need to be taken into consideration, that a Canadian judge can look at and make sense of to find an alternative to prison time.
There's a Cherokee notion of Gadugi. No one person is left to struggle in life on their own. And if we're truly practicing Gadugi, we can't ignore or leave out anyone in our community. We have to understand how to live as a community again.
If you think of three concentric circles, there's the individual and the family and the community. And so at all times, Indigenous law can be the path to finding healing throughout those rings of those circles.
Who are we, right? Who is Canada? What's our proper relationship to each other and to territories, and how are we going to work together? The critical work that Indigenous law has in helping to answer those questions, it's never been more important.
I've been now reading Raven stories, And the world changes for me now when I am somewhere and a raven or a crow hops by on the edge. I start thinking how many raven stories I know and that they are pulled back into your mind. You start seeing law around you, reminding you of stories which remind you of obligations, of crises, of failures. The law lays itself on you in a very different, in a very rich way, in a way that connects you to the space around you. Law becomes visible.
So it's like Cree elder Louis Bird when he said, stories are for thinking. What do the stories make us think about, and how do they make us think?